In the last few sessions, we have identified two of the main ways in which our linguistic usage can differ from standard common linguistic usage: tropological usage, or tropes, and figurative usage, or figures. These two main kinds of unusual linguistic usage feature in Western poetry from Homer onwards. And they feature in those texts that Anglophones have had in mind from the 14th century, when they first started using the word poetry to refer to a kind of literary text. It is in part because tropes and figures featured in poetry from the very beginning that the earliest discussions of poetry in Western tradition developed a special vocabulary to identify, describe, and understand them. And the terms we are using to identify different tropes and figures in Wordsworth's poem and beyond derive from these earliest discussions of the ancient Greeks and Romans. I have provided a list of these terms with definitions and examples in documents attached to the sessions on tropes and figures. You can also find many of these terms in any good glossary of literary terms. I've always liked and preferred Abrams, M.H. Abrams' Glossary of Literary Terms, which has gone through several editions over the last 40 or 50 years. But if you want to, where does Abrams go to get his definitions? Well, he goes to the ancient Greek and Roman texts. If you want to get definitions of these terms and commentary on them from the horse's mouth, the main places to go are the following. It's Aristotle, Poetics and Rhetoric, ancient Greek philosopher. Demetrius on style. The Rhetorica ad Herennium, which for a long time was thought to be by Cicero, no longer is, but there's a tradition of attributing that work to Cicero. The Rhetorica ad Herennium, extremely important text, by the way, for the Renaissance, European Renaissance theorists of rhetoric. Quintilian, Institutes of Oratory, provides an extensive, comprehensive discussion of the tropes and figures. And then Longinus on sublimity. Those are some of the main ancient Greek and Roman texts which provide definitions of the terms we now use to identify and discuss the tropes and figures. Note that some of these texts, by the way, are ones that are mainly about not literature, but oratory or rhetoric. That is to say, some of these texts are mainly concerned with how to praise and blame people, how to use language to praise and to blame people, how to argue in courts of law, how to persuade governors and crowds what to believe and do. And that alerts us to an important aspect of Western tradition at large. Oratory and literature have something very important in common, namely tropological and figurative language. And because tropes and figures are important elements of not just literature, but oratory, works that describe and teach oratory by the ancient Greeks and Romans end up being foundational texts for literary studies in Western tradition. Now let's use some of the terms for figures in order to describe Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and in order to improve our understanding and enjoyment of it. There are several figures in the poem, and I think they contribute to the overall achievement of it. They're not highly conspicuous, grand, extended versions of the figures. Rather, they're figures on a small scale, modest, inconspicuous instances of figurative language, but figurative language nonetheless. You recall that the poem begins this way. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. What did Wordsworth see while he saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils? As we have seen, the use of crowd and host to refer to many flowers is a metaphorical usage. But the expression a crowd, a host is also figurative. It's a small instance of anaphora, since it consists of two consecutive phrases beginning with the same word, a. It's also a little parallelism, since it consists of a repetition of a grammatical structure or sequence. Indefinite article, noun. An indefinite article noun sequence is repeated in a host, in a crowd, a host. I think the figure slows down the utterance. A host, the words a host, they're set off by a line break and two commas, a crowd, comma, line break, a host of golden daffodils. The addition of host, I think, makes the line pause ever so slightly before proceeding to identify of what it was a host or crowd, golden daffodils. As a result of the anaphora, the line does not rush or surge forward, but makes the description proceed slowly in a more measured, orderly fashion. In so doing, I think the figure also slightly amplifies the numerousness of the flowers. Not, I saw many golden daffodils, and not, I saw a crowd of golden daffodils, but I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Rather than moving quickly forward, the line stays still, the description stays still, and expands and exfoliates rather than moves on. As in so many other instances of this figure in English poetry, anaphora here, I think, serves to give the impression of richness, abundance, plenitude. In this case, an abundance of flowers. I think we get a more conspicuous but still modest instance of parallelism later in the stanza, the lines following a host of golden daffodils, where the stanza concludes with that couplet. Beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Beside the lake, beneath the trees. Preposition, definite article, noun, beside the lake. Preposition, definite article, noun, beneath the trees. And so a parallelism, a repetition of a sequence of words or grammatical structure, a simple parallelism preceded by a semicolon at the end of that preceding line, and then divided in the middle with a comma, and then a comma at the end of the line. So again, the description does not rush forward, but proceeds one short phrase at a time in an orderly, measured fashion. It's not grand, majestic, forceful, obscure, difficult to understand. Rather, as a result of the parallelism, but also, notice the regular iambic tetrameter meter. It's a very regular line. Beside the lake, beneath the trees. Right? As a result of the parallelism and that iambic tetrameter meter, the line is simple, clear, it's balanced. And that sense of balance, beside the lake, beneath the trees. Orderly, refined, and easy to understand, I would say. Also, on some common definitions of beautiful, it is beautiful. Do you take pleasure in small, delicate things, balanced, symmetrical things, modest things, simple things, beautiful things, petite things? Are you like the English poet Keats, who felt that a thing of beauty is a joy forever, who felt that beautiful things cause us to experience joy? Well, if so, then the language here may well give you a certain kind of pleasure and joy. perhaps the simple repetition of words is not so unusual in everyday speech, but it is still identified as a figure in the great catalogs, the ancient Greco-Roman and Renaissance catalogs of figures, and it is called ploce. So we have a ploce in the poem when Wordsworth writes in the third stanza. The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. Again, a figure based on a kind of repetition, this time the simple repetition of words. What's the difference between a more common way of speaking, as in, I gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought, and this, I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. Again, I think the figure ploce here slows down the utterance, especially because, again, the repeated word is set off by punctuation, in this case, dashes. Right? A second gazed is set off from the first gazed by dashes. Notice also that long vowel, I believe it's a diphthong, gazed. Pausing, repeating the word gazed to describe his perception. I think Wordsworth expresses the feelings of wonder and amazement. It says, right, that repetition, that ploce, I think, goes to give us a sense of, or to express Wordsworth's amazement and wonder that he felt when he saw those flowers. Notice also that there are several instances of hyperbaton in the poem. That is to say, a simple inversion or reversal of common word order. So I believe it would be more common for us to say, they stretched a never-ending line along the margin of a bay, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way. But Wordsworth has an inverted order. The simile is inverted. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched a never-ending line along the margin of a bay. I think we might well say, I saw 10,000 at a glance. But Wordsworth writes, 10,000 saw I at a glance. Many Anglophones, I think, would say, the waves danced beside them. The waves danced, subject, verb, and then some sort of adverbial clause. The waves danced beside them. But Wordsworth says, the waves beside them danced, right? He places the verb at the end of the sentence. And instead of, and then my heart fills with pleasure, he has, and then my heart with pleasure fills. Again, placing the verb at the end of the sentence. So there are several instances of hyperbaton in the poem. In his wonderful treatise on sublimity, Longinus, whom I mentioned earlier in this session, observes that, he comments on this figure, hyperbaton, and observes that it is a very real mark of urgent emotion. Longinus goes on to say that people who in real life feel emotion often put one thing forward and then rush off to another, irrationally inserting some remark and then hark back again to their first point. They seem to be blown this way and that by their excitement. Well, if this is how people are, we might find that some of the hyperbata mark or express Wordsworth's feelings of excitement and wonder when he saw the flowers. I think this especially holds for this one. Instead of, I saw 10,000 at a glance, it's 10,000 saw at a glance. It certainly lends itself to a reading, an excited reading of that line, that hyperbaton. Quintilian also comments on hyperbaton, the ancient Roman theorist of rhetoric and education, whom I mentioned at the beginning of the session as well. Quintilian, he comments on hyperbaton, but he emphasizes how the figure can serve to avoid some of the rather unpleasant characteristics of everyday linguistic usage. So he observes our language would often be harsh, rough, limp, or disjointed if the words were always arranged in their natural order. And so in order to avoid these features of these rather unpleasant features of common linguistic usage, Quintilian observes that we can rearrange our words. He has a great analogy. He compares those who are trying to build a strong, smooth wall out of unhewn stone with a person who is trying to speak in a way that is smooth and elegant. Right? Just as a person trying to build a wall of unhewn stone must rearrange the stones in all kinds of ways in order to achieve a smooth, strong, good-looking wall. So those who wish to speak in a way that is smooth and strong need to rearrange their words to make them fit together in a certain way. And Quintilian observes that hyperbaton, this figure, is one way that can help poets and rhetoricians meet what he calls the claims of elegance. Right? You can achieve smoothness and strength and elegance by way of hyperbaton. I do think that some of the other small instances of hyperbaton in the Wordsworth poem, they go to achieve that smoothness and elegance and refinement that Wordsworth achieves in this poem. And I would say that I do want to use those terms to describe whatever Wordsworth may say about the language of men in the preface to Lyrical Ballads. I think that in this poem, the language is elegant and refined, in part because of these hyperbeta. We noted in an earlier session that there is something a little unusual about Wordsworth's description of the flowers. In the first stanza, after the first 4 lines, he does not say, beside the lake beneath the trees, they were fluttering and dancing in the breeze, but beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. In the next stanza, he doesn't say 10,000 saw I at a glance that were tossing their heads in sprightly dance. It's 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. It's not the flowers outdid the waves that were sparkling in glee. It's the waves beside them dance, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. Perhaps it's a little too fine a point, but I feel that Wordsworth is omitting words that might well be there in more common ways of describing what he's describing. In particular, I think he omits the word were, which is usually the auxiliary verb in past progressive tenses with a plural subject. We say they were doing something. There's no were in Wordsworth's description of what the flowers were doing. So I feel it's reasonable to think that ellipsis is an important figure in this poem, where ellipsis is the omission of words. Again, I think these instances of ellipsis, the omission of were, is one little thing that makes the utterance more refined and elegant, light, as opposed to verbose and heavy. Also, the ellipsis does not nail down the dancing flowers to a moment in the past, but makes it seem as though, in some important sense, the flowers' action of dancing is present and ongoing. It's as though they are dancing, not that they were dancing. It's as though that they continue to dance, that they are dancing. I think it does go to our sense of the way in which the action of the flowers is ongoing and present, as indeed Wordsworth says it is in some sense. In his mind, they're still dancing, and he dances with them. Finally, we have a small instance of polysyndeton in the final stanza, I think. That is to say, you have consecutive phrases, clauses, or lines joined with conjunctions. So the poem concludes with, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Note the simplicity of the utterance. The addition of one little clause followed by another, joined by the conjunctions and. They flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. It's a very simple grammatical construction proceeding by addition. Easy to understand, and I think it allows the poem to conclude on a modest, charming note. So there are several instances of figurative language in the poem. Anaphora, parallelism, ploce, hyperbaton, ellipsis, and polysyndeton. For the most part, these figures are not extended, grand, conspicuous. They're modest and small. Let me conclude by drawing a contrast between the figurative language in this poem and the more conspicuous, grand, extended figurative language we often get in Shakespeare. I think an example of this kind of thing is Richard III's speech at the beginning of Richard III. Here it is. Notice that you have, in this case, groups of 4 lines, consecutive groups of 4 lines, all beginning with the same word. And then within the 13-line speech, there are further instances of anaphora and parallelism. So Richard comes out on stage and says, now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. And all the clouds are loud upon our house in the deep bosom of the ocean buried. Now are our brows bound with victorious wreaths, our bruised arms hung up for monuments, our stern alarms changed to merry meetings, our dreadful marches to delightful measures. Grim-visaged war has smoothed his wrinkled front, and now, instead of mounting barbed steeds to fight the souls of fearful adversaries, he capers nimbly in a lady's chamber to the lascivious pleasing of a lute. That's grand, conspicuous, showy figurative language. Grand, conspicuous instances of anaphora and parallelism. Wordsworth's figurative language in his poem, I Want It Only in Cloud, as a cloud, is not like that. It's different from the kind of grand, conspicuous figurative language we get at the opening of Richard III. Wordsworth's figurative language is smaller, it's modest, inconspicuous, but figurative language nonetheless. And I think that observing this figurative language in the poem can help us to understand why the utterance is elegant, measured, simple, clear, graphic, but also expressive of feelings such as wonder and excitement. And so observing this about the poem can help us understand why it can provide us with some pleasurable experiences that we don't get from other kinds of text and other kinds of literature. Now, the next time, we will conclude the course by just reviewing and elaborating upon some of the things that we have been doing all along in this course.